His movement was swift and sudden, but, as Lee had anticipated, the Federal position was strongly fortified, with the flanks secure, and Longstreet had no mind to bring matters to a speedy conclusion. He could reduce the place, he wrote on April 17th, in 2 or 3 days, but the expenditure of ammunition would be very large, or he could take it by assault, but at a cost of 3,000 men. The Secretary of War agreed with him that the sacrifice would be too great, and so, at a time when Hooker was becoming active on the Rappahannock, Lee's lieutenant was quietly investing Suffolk, 120 miles away. From that moment, the commander-in-chief abandoned all hope that his missing divisions would be with him when Hooker moved. Bitterly indeed was he to suffer for his selection of a commander for his detached force. The loss of 3,000 men at Suffolk, had the works been stormed, and Hood and Pickett marched instantly to the Rappahannock, would have been more than repaid. The addition of 12,000 fine soldiers, flushed with success, and led by 2 of the most brilliant fighting generals in the Confederate armies, would have made the victory of Chancellorsville a decisive triumph. Better still had Longstreet adhered to his original orders. But both he and Mr. Seddon forgot, as Jackson never did, the value of time and the grand principle of concentration at the decisive point. Happily for the South, Hooker, although less flagrantly, was also oblivious of the first axiom of war. As soon as the weather improved, he determined to move against Richmond. His task, however, was no simple one. On the opposite bank of the Rappahannock, from Banks Ford to Port Royal, a distance of 20 miles, frowned line upon line of fortifications, protected by a battis, manned by a numerous artillery, against which it was difficult to find position for the Federal guns, and occupied by the victors of Fredericksburg. A frontal attack gave even less promise of success than in Burnside's disastrous battle. But behind Lee's earthworks were his lines of supply, the Richmond Railway running due south, with the road to Bowling Green alongside, and second, the Plank Road, which, running at first due west, led past Chancellorsville, a large brick mansion standing in a dense forest, to Orange Courthouse and the depots on the Virginia Central Railroad. At these roads and railways, Hooker determined to strike, expecting that Lee would at once fall back and give the Army of the Potomac the opportunity of delivering a heavy blow. To effect his object, he divided his 130,000 men into 3 distinct bodies. The cavalry, which, with the exception of one small brigade, had moved under General Stoneman to Warrenton Junction, was to march by way of Rappahannock Station, and either capturing or passing Culpeper and Gordonsville, to cut the Confederate communications, and should Lee retreat, to hold him fast. General Sedgwick, with 2 army corps, the 1st and 6th, forming the left wing of the army, was to cross the river below Fredericksburg, make a brisk demonstration of attack, and if the enemy fell back, follow him rapidly down the Bowling Green and Telegraph roads. Then, while Lee's attention was thus attracted, the right wing, composed of the 5th, 11th, and 12th Corps, with Pleasonton's brigade of cavalry, under Hooker's own command, would move up the Rappahannock to Kelly's Ford, push forward to the Rapidan, cross at Ely's and Germanna Fords, and march upon Chancellorsville. The 3rd Corps was to remain concentrated on the Stafford Heights, ready to reinforce either wing as circumstances might require. The 2nd Corps was to leave 1 division on outpost at Falmouth, and to post 2 divisions on the north bank of the Rappahannock opposite Banks Ford. It will be observed that this design would place a wide interval between the 2 wings of the Federal Army, thus giving the Confederates, although much inferior in numbers, the advantage of the interior lines. Hooker, however, who knew the Confederate strength to a man, was confident that Lee, directly he found his position turned, and Stoneman in his rear, would at once retreat on Richmond. Yet he was not blind to the possibility that his great adversary, always daring, might assume the offensive and attempt to crush the Federal wings in detail. Still, the danger appeared small. Either wing was practically equal to the whole Confederate force. Sedgwick had 40,000, with the 3rd Corps 19,000 and a division of the 2nd, 5,500, close at hand. Hooker 42,000, with 2 divisions of the 2nd Corps, 11,000, at Banks's Ford. The 3rd Corps could reinforce him in less than 24 hours, and Stoneman's 10,000 sabres, riding at will amongst Lee's supply depots, would surely prevent him from attacking. Still precaution was taken in case the attempt were made. Sedgwick, if the enemy detached any considerable part of his force towards Chancellorsville, was to carry the works at all hazards and establish his force on the Telegraph Road. The right wing, if not strongly resisted, was to advance at all hazards and secure a position uncovering Banks' Ford. Were the Confederates found in force near Chancellorsville, it was to select a strong position and await attack on its own ground, while Sedgwick, coming up from Fredericksburg, would assail the enemy in flank and rear. Such was the plan which, if resolutely carried out, bade fair to crush Lee's army between the upper and the nether millstones, and it seems that the size and condition of his forces led Hooker to anticipate an easy victory. If the Army of the Potomac was not the finest on the planet, as in an order of the day he boastfully proclaimed it, it possessed many elements of strength. Hooker was a strict disciplinarian with a talent for organization. He had not only done much to improve the efficiency of his troops, but his vigorous measures had gone far to restore their confidence. When he succeeded Burnside, a large proportion of the soldiers had lost heart and hope. The generals who had hitherto commanded them, when compared with Lee and Jackson, were mere pygmies, and the consciousness that this was the case had affected the entire army. The official records contain much justification of Jackson's anxiety that Burnside should be fought on the North Anna, where, if defeated, he might have been pursued. Although there had been no pursuit after the Battle of Fredericksburg, no harassing marches, no continued retreat, with lack of supplies, abandoning of wounded and constant alarms, the Federal regiments had suffered terribly in moral. "The winter rains set in," said Hooker, "and all operations were for a while suspended, the army literally finding itself buried in mud, from which there was no hope of extrication before spring. With this prospect before it, taken in connection with the gloom and despondency which followed the disaster of Fredericksburg, the army was in a forlorn, deplorable condition. Reference to the letters from the army at this time, public and private, affords abundant evidence of its demoralization, and these, in their turn, had their effect upon the friends and relatives of the soldiers at home. At the time the army was turned over to me, desertions were at the rate of about 200 a day. So anxious were parents, wives, brothers and sisters to relieve their kindred, that they filled the express trains with packages of citizens' clothing to assist them in escaping from service. At that time, perhaps, a majority of the officers, especially those high in rank, were hostile to the policy of the government in the conduct of the war. The Emancipation Proclamation had been published a short time before, and a large element of the army had taken sides antagonistic to it, declaring that they would never have embarked in the war had they anticipated the action of the government. When rest came to the army, the disaffected, from whatever cause, began to show themselves, and make their influence felt in and out of the camps. I may also state that at the moment I was placed in command, I caused a return to be made of the absentees of the army, and found the number to be 2,922 commissioned officers and 81,964 non-commissioned officers and privates. They were scattered all over the country, and the majority were absent from causes unknown. In the face of this remarkable report, it is curious to read, in the pages of a brilliant military historian, that armies composed of the citizens of a free country, who have taken up arms from patriotic motives, have constantly exhibited an astonishing endurance, and possessing a bond of cohesion superior to discipline, have shown their power to withstand shocks that would dislocate the structure of other military organizations. A force which had lost 25% of its strength by desertion, although it had never been pursued after defeat, would not generally be suspected of peculiar solidity. Nevertheless, the northern soldiers must receive their due. Want of discipline made fearful ravages in the ranks, but notwithstanding the defection of so many of their comrades, Those that remained faithful displayed the best characteristics of their race. The heart of the army was still sound, and only the influence of a strong and energetic commander was required to restore its vitality. This influence was supplied by Hooker. The cumbrous organization of grand divisions was abolished. Disloyal and unsuccessful generals were removed. Salutary changes were introduced into the various departments of the staff. The cavalry, hitherto formed in independent brigades, was consolidated into a corps of 3 divisions and a brigade of regulars, and under a system of careful and uniform inspection made rapid improvement. Strong measures were taken to reduce the number of deserters. The ranks were filled by the return of absentees. New regiments were added to the army corps. The troops were constantly practiced in field exercises, and generals of well-deserved reputation were selected for the different commands. All were actuated, wrote Hooker, by feelings of confidence and devotion to the cause, and I felt that it was a living army and one well worthy of the Republic. On April 27th, after several demonstrations, undertaken with a view of confusing the enemy, had been made at various points, the grand movement began. The Confederate army still held the lines it had occupied for the past 4 months. Jackson's army corps extended from Hamilton's Crossing to Port Royal. McLaws and Anderson's divisions occupied Lee's Hill and the ridge northward, and a brigade watched Banks' Ford. Stuart was with his main body, some 2,400 strong, at Culpeper, observing the great mass of Federal horsemen at Warrenton Junction, and the line of the Rappahannock was held by cavalry pickets. The strength of the Army of Northern Virginia, so far as can be ascertained, did not exceed 62,000 officers and men. Thus the road to Richmond, threatened by a host of 130,000 men and 428 guns, was to be defended by a force of less than half the size. 99 generals out of 100 would have considered the situation hopeless. The Confederate lines at Fredericksburg were certainly very strong, but it was clearly impossible to prevent the Federals outflanking them. The disparity in strength was far greater than at Sharpsburg, and it seemed that by sheer weight of numbers the Southern army must inevitably be driven back. Nor did it appear, so overwhelming were the Federal numbers, that counterattack was feasible. The usual resource of the defender, if his adversary marches round his flank, is to strike boldly at his communications. Here, however, Hooker's communications with Aquia Creek were securely covered by the Rappahannock, and so great was his preponderance of strength that he could easily detach a sufficient force to check the Confederates should they move against them. Yet now, as on the Antietam, Lee and Jackson declined to take numbers into consideration. They knew that Hooker was a brave and experienced soldier, but they had no reason to anticipate that he would handle his vast masses with more skill than McClellan. That the Northern soldiers had suffered in moral they were well aware, and while they divined that the position they themselves had fortified might readily be made untenable, the fact that such was the case gave them small concern. They were agreed that the best measures of defence, if an opening offered, lay in a resolute offensive, and with Hooker in command it was not likely that the opportunity would be long delayed. No thought of a strategic retreat from one position to another was entertained. Manoeuvre was to be met by manoeuvre, blow by counterblow. If Hooker had not moved, Lee would have forestalled him. On April 16th, he had written to Mr. Davis, "My only anxiety arises from the condition of our horses and the scarcity of forage and provisions. I think it is all important that we should assume the aggressive by the 1st of May. If we could be placed in a condition to make a vigorous advance at that time, I think the valley could be swept of Milroy, commanding the Federal forces at Winchester, and the army opposite Hooker's be thrown north of the Potomac." Jackson, too, even after Hooker's plan was developed, indignantly repudiated the suggestion that the forthcoming campaign must be purely defensive. When some officer on his staff expressed his fear that the army would be compelled to retreat, he asked sharply, "Who said that? No, sir, we shall not fall back. We shall attack them." At the end of the month, however, Longstreet with his 3 divisions was still absent, Sufficient supplies for a forward movement had not yet been accumulated. 2 brigades of cavalry, Hampton's and Jenkins, which had been sent respectively to South Carolina and the Valley, had not rejoined, and Hooker had already seized the initiative. The first news which came to hand was that a strong force of all arms was moving up the Rappahannock in the direction of Kelly's Ford. April 28th. This was forwarded by Stuart on the evening of April 28th. The next morning the Federal movements, which might have been no more than a demonstration, became pronounced. April 29th. Under cover of a thick fog, pontoon bridges were laid at Deep Run below Fredericksburg. Sedgwick's troops began to cross and were soon engaged with Jackson's outposts, while at the same time the report came in that a force of unknown strength had made the passage at Kelly's Ford. Lee displayed no perturbation. Jackson, on receiving information of Sedgwick's movement from his outposts, had sent an aide-de-camp to acquaint the commander-in-chief. The latter was still in his tent, and in reply to the message said, "Well, I heard firing, and I was beginning to think that it was time some of your lazy young fellows were coming to tell me what it was about. Tell your good general he knows what to do with the enemy just as well as I do." The divisions of the Second Army Corps were at once called up to their old battleground, and while they were on the march, Jackson occupied himself with watching Sedgwick's movements. The Federals were busily entrenching on the riverbank, and on the heights behind frowned the long line of artillery that had proved at Fredericksburg so formidable an obstacle to the Confederate attack. The enemy's position was very strong, and the time for counterstroke had not yet come. During the day the cavalry was actively engaged between the Rappahannock and the Rapidan, testing the strength of the enemy's columns. The country was wooded, the Federals active, and as usual in war, accurate information was difficult to obtain and more difficult to communicate. It was not till 6:30 p.m. that Lee received notice that troops had crossed at Ely's and Germanna Fords at 2 p.m. Anderson's division was at once dispatched to Chancellorsville, April 30th. The next message, which does not appear to have been received until the morning of the 30th, threw more light on the situation. Stuart had made prisoners from the 5th, the 11th, and the 12th Corps, and had ascertained that the corps commanders, Meade, Howard, and Slocum, were present with the troops. Anderson, moreover, who had been instructed to select and entrench a strong position, was falling back from Chancellorsville before the enemy's advance, and 2 things became clear. That it was Hooker's intention to turn the Confederate left, that he had divided his forces. The question now to be decided was which wing should be attacked first. There was much to be said in favour of crushing Sedgwick. His numbers were estimated at 35,000 men, and the Confederates had over 60,000. Moreover, time is a most important consideration in the use of interior lines. The army was already concentrated in front of Sedgwick, whereas it would require a day's march to seek Hooker in the forest round Chancellorsville. Sedgwick's, too, was the smaller of the Federal wings, and his overthrow would certainly ruin Hooker's combinations. Jackson at first, said Lee, preferred to attack Sedgwick's force in the plain of Fredericksburg, but I told him I feared it was as impracticable as it was at the first battle of Fredericksburg. It was hard to get at the enemy, and harder to get away if we drove him into the river, but if he thought it could be done, I would give orders for it. Jackson asked to be allowed to examine the ground, but soon came to the conclusion that the project was too hazardous, and that Lee was right. Orders were then issued for a concentration against Hooker, 10,000 men, under General Early, remaining to confront Sedgwick on the heights of Fredericksburg. We may now turn to the movements of the Federals. Hooker's right wing had marched at a speed which had been hitherto unknown in the Army of the Potomac. At nightfall on April 30th, the 3 Army Corps, although they had been delayed by the Confederate cavalry, were assembled at Chancellorsville. In 3 days they had marched 46 miles over bad roads, had forded breast-high 2 difficult rivers, established several bridges, and captured over 100 prisoners. Heavy reinforcements were in rear. The 2 divisions of the Second Corps had marched from Banks's Ford to United States Ford, 6 miles from Chancellorsville, while the Third Corps, ordered up from the Stafford Heights, was rapidly approaching the same point of passage. Thus, 70,000 men, in the highest spirits at the success of their manoeuvres, were massed in rear of Lee's lines, and Hooker saw victory within his grasp. "It is with heartfelt satisfaction," ran his general order, "that the commanding general announces to his army that the operations of the last 3 days have determined that our enemy must either ingloriously fly or come out from behind his defences and give us battle on our own ground, where certain destruction awaits him. The operations of the 5th, 11th, and 12th Corps have been a succession of splendid achievements." Hooker was skinning the lion while the beast yet lived, but he had certainly much reason for congratulation. His manoeuvres had been skillfully planned and energetically executed. The 2 rivers which protected the Confederate position had been crossed without loss. The 2nd and 3rd Corps had been brought into close touch with the right wing. Lee's earthworks were completely turned, and Stoneman's cavalry divisions, driving the enemy's patrols before them, were already within reach of Orange Courthouse, and not more than 20 miles from Gordonsville. Best of all, the interval between the 2 wings, 26 miles on the night of the 28th, was now reduced to 11 miles by the plank road. 2 things only were unsatisfactory: the absence of information, the fact that the whole movement had been observed by the Confederate cavalry. Pleasanton's brigade of horse had proved too weak for the duty assigned to it. It had been able to protect the front, but it was too small to cover the flanks, and at the flanks Stuart had persistently struck. Hooker appears to have believed that Stoneman's advance against the Central Railroad would draw off the whole of the Confederate horse. Stuart, however, was not to be beguiled from his proper functions. Never were his squadrons more skillfully handled than in this campaign. With fine tactical insight, as soon as the great movement on Chancellorsville became pronounced, he had attacked the right flank of the Federal columns with Fitzhugh Lee's brigade, leaving only the 2 regiments under W.H.F. Lee to watch Stoneman's 10,000 sabres. Then, having obtained the information he required, he moved across the Federal front, and routing one of Pleasanton's regiments in a night affair near Spotsylvania Courthouse, he had regained touch with his own army. The results of his manoeuvres were of the utmost importance. Lee was fully informed as to his adversary's strength. The Confederate cavalry was in superior strength at the critical point, that is, along the front of the 2 armies, and Hooker had no knowledge whatever of what was going on in the space between Sedgwick and himself. He was only aware on the night of April 30th that the Confederate position before Fredericksburg was still strongly occupied. The want, however, of accurate information gave him no uneasiness. The most careful arrangements had been made to note and report every movement of the enemy the next day. No less than 3 captive balloons, in charge of skilled observers, looked down upon the Confederate earthworks. Signal stations and observatories had been established on each commanding height. A line of field telegraph had been laid from Falmouth to United States Ford, and the Chief of the Staff, General Butterfield, remained at the former village in communication with General Sedgwick. If the weather were clear and the telegraph did not fail, it seemed impossible that either wing of the Federal Army could fail to be fully and instantly informed of the situation of the other, or that a single Confederate battalion could change position without both Hooker and Sedgwick being at once advised. Moreover, the Federal commander-in-chief was so certain that Lee would retreat that his deficiency in cavalry troubled him not at all. He had determined to carry out his original design. May 1st. The next morning, May 1st, the right wing was to move by the plank road and uncover Banks Ford, thus still further shortening the line of communication between the 2 wings. And as the Chief of the Staff impressed on Sedgwick, it was expected to be on the heights west of Fredericksburg at noon or shortly after, or, if opposed strongly, at night. Sedgwick, meanwhile, was to observe the enemy's movements with the utmost vigilance. Should he expose a weak point, to attack him in full force and destroy him. Should he show any symptom of falling back, to pursue him with the utmost vigour. But Hooker was to find that mere mechanical precautions are not an infallible remedy for a dangerous situation. The Confederates had not only learned long since the importance of concealment and the advantage of night marches, but in the early morning of May 1st, the river mists rendered both balloons and observatories useless. Long before the sun broke through the fog, both McLaws and Jackson had joined Anderson at Tabernacle Church, and a strong line of battle had been established at the junction of the two roads, the Pike and the Plank, which led east from Chancellorsville. The position was favourable, running along a low ridge, partially covered with timber and with open fields in front. Beyond those fields, a few hundred paces distant, rose the outskirts of a great forest, stretching far away over a gently undulating country. This forest, 20 miles in length from east to west, and 15 in breadth from north to south, has given to the region it covers the name of the Wilderness of Spotsylvania, and in its midst the Federal army was now involved. Never was ground more unfavourable for the manoeuvres of a large army. The timber was unusually dense. The groves of pines were immersed in a sea of scrub oak and luxuriant undergrowth. The soil was poor. Farms were rare, and the few clearings were seldom more than a rifle shot in width. The woodland tracks were seldom travelled. Streams with marshy banks and tortuous courses were met at frequent intervals, and the only debouché towards Fredericksburg, the Pike, the Plank Road, an unfinished line of railway a mile south of their junction, and the River Road, about 2 miles north, were commanded from the Confederate position. 8 a.m. When Jackson arrived upon the scene, Anderson, with the help of Lee's engineers, had strongly entrenched the whole front. A large force of artillery had already taken post. The flanks of the line were covered. The right, which extended to near Dewerson's Mill by Mott's Run and the Rappahannock, the left, which rested on the unfinished railroad not far from Tabernacle Church by the Massaponax Creek. For the defence of this position, 3 miles in length, there were present 45,000 infantry, over 100 guns, and Fitzhugh Lee's brigade of cavalry, a force ample for the purpose, and giving about 9 men to the yard. On the rolling ground eastward there was excellent cover for the reserves, and from the breastworks to the front the defiles, for such, owing to the density of the wood, were the 4 roads by which the enemy must approach, might be so effectively swept as to prevent him from deploying either artillery or infantry. But Jackson was not disposed to await attack. Only 10,000 men remained in the Fredericksburg lines to confront Sedgwick, and if that officer acted vigorously, his guns would soon be heard in rear of the lines at Tabernacle Church. Work on the entrenchments was at once broken off, and the whole force was ordered to prepare for an immediate advance on Chancellorsville. 10:45 a.m. Before 11 o'clock the rear brigades had closed up, and marching by the Pike and the Plank Road, with a regiment of cavalry in advance, and Fitzhugh Lee upon the left, the Confederate army plunged resolutely into the gloomy depths of the great forest. Anderson's division led the way, 1 brigade on the Pike and 2 on the Plank Road. A strong line of skirmishers covered his whole front, and his 5 batteries brought up the rear. Next in order came McLaws, together with the 2 remaining brigades of Anderson, moving by the Pike, while Jackson's 3 divisions were on the Plank Road. The artillery followed the infantry. About a mile towards Chancellorsville, the Federal cavalry was found in some force, and as the patrols gave way, a heavy force of infantry was discovered in movement along the Pike. General McLaws, who had been placed in charge of the Confederate right, immediately deployed his 4 leading brigades, and after the Federal artillery, unlimbering in an open field, had fired a few rounds, their infantry advanced to the attack. The fight was spirited but short. The northern regulars of Sykes's division drove in the Confederate skirmishers, but were unable to make ground against the line of battle. Jackson, meanwhile, who had been at once informed of the encounter, had ordered the troops on the Plank Road to push briskly forward, and the Federals, finding their right in danger of being enveloped, retired on Chancellorsville. Another hostile column was shortly afterwards met on the Plank Road, also marching eastward. Again there was a skirmish, and again Jackson, ordering a brigade to march rapidly along the unfinished railroad, had recourse to a turning movement. But before the manoeuvre was completed, the Federals began to yield, and all opposition gradually melted away. The following order was then sent to McLaws. 2:30 p.m. Headquarters, 2nd Corps, Army of Northern Virginia, May 1st, 1863, 2:30 p.m. Received 4 p.m. General, the Lieutenant General commanding directs me to say that he is pressing up the Plank Road. Also, that you will press on up the turnpike towards Chancellorsville as the enemy is falling back. Keep your skirmishers and flanking parties well out to guard against ambuscade. Very respectfully, your obedient servant, J.G. Morrison, Acting Assistant Adjutant General. There was something mysterious in so easy a victory. The enemy was evidently in great strength, for on both roads heavy columns had been observed behind the lines of skirmishers. Several batteries had been in action, cavalry was present, and the Confederate scouts reported that a third column of all arms had marched by the river road toward Banks's Ford, and had then, like the others, unaccountably withdrawn. The pursuit, therefore, was slow and circumspect. Wilcox's brigade, on the extreme right, moved up the Mine Road in the direction of Duerson's Mill. Wright's brigade, on the extreme left, followed Fitzhugh Lee's cavalry on the unfinished railroad, while the main body, well closed up, still kept to the main highways. 5 p.m. At length, late in the afternoon, Hooker's tactics became clear. As Jackson's advanced guards approached Chancellorsville, the resistance of the Federal skirmishers covering the retreat became more stubborn. From the low ridge, fringed by heavy timber, on which the mansion stands, the fire of artillery, raking every avenue of approach, grew more intense, and it was evident that the foe was standing fast on the defensive. The Confederate infantry, pushing forward through the undergrowth, made but tardy progress. The cavalry patrols found that every road and bridle path was strongly held, and it was difficult in the extreme to discover Hooker's exact position. Jackson himself, riding to the front to reconnoitre, nearly fell a victim to the recklessness he almost invariably displayed when in quest of information. The cavalry had been checked at Catherine Furnace and were waiting the approach of the infantry. Wright's brigade was close at hand, and swinging round northwards, drove back the enemy's skirmishers until, in its turn, it was brought up by the fire of artillery. Just at this moment Jackson galloped up and begged Stuart to ride forward with him in order to find a point from which the enemy's guns might be enfiladed. A bridle path, branching off from the main road to the right, led to a hillock about half a mile distant, and the two generals, accompanied by their staffs and followed by a battery of horse artillery, made for this point of vantage. On reaching the spot, says Stuart's adjutant general, so dense was the undergrowth, it was found impossible to find enough clear space to bring more than one gun at a time into position. The others closed up immediately behind, and the whole body of us completely blocked up the narrow road. Scarcely had the smoke of our first shot cleared away, when a couple of masked batteries suddenly opened on us at short range, and enveloped us in a storm of shell and canister, which, concentrated on so narrow a space, did fearful execution among our party, men and horses falling right and left, the animals kicking and plunging wildly, and everybody eager to disentangle himself from the confusion and get out of harm's way. Jackson, as soon as he found out his mistake, ordered the guns to retire, but the confined space so protracted the operation of turning that the enemy's cannon had full time to continue their havoc, covering the road with dead and wounded. That Jackson and Stuart with their staff officers escaped was nothing short of miraculous. Other attempts at reconnaissance were more successful. Before nightfall it was ascertained that Hooker was in strong force on the Chancellorsville Ridge alongs the Plank Road and on a bare plateau to the southward called Hazel Grove. Here, in the words of General Lee, he had assumed a position of great natural strength, surrounded on all sides by a dense forest, filled with a tangled undergrowth, in the midst of which breastworks of logs had been constructed, with trees felled in front so as to form an almost impenetrable abattis. His artillery swept the few narrow roads by which the position could be approached from the front and commanded the adjacent woods. The left of his line extended from Chancellorsville towards the Rappahannock, covering the Bark Mill, United States Ford, which communicated with the north bank of the river by a pontoon bridge. His right stretched westward along the Germanna Ford Road, the Pike, more than 2 miles. As the nature of the country rendered it hazardous to attack by night, our troops halted and formed in line of battle in front of Chancellorsville at right angles to the Plank Road, extending on the right to the Mine Road and to the left in the direction of the Catherine Furnace. As darkness falls upon the wilderness and the fire of the outposts, provoked by every movement of the patrols, gradually dies away, we may seek the explanation of the Federal movements. On finding that his enemy, instead of ingloriously flying, was advancing to meet him, and advancing with confident and aggressive vigour, Hooker's resolution had failed him. Waiting till his force was concentrated, until the 2nd and 3rd Corps had crossed at United States Ford, and were close to Chancellorsville, it was not till 11 o'clock on the morning of May 1st that he had marched in 3 great columns towards Fredericksburg. His intention was to pass rapidly through the wilderness, secure the open ground about Tabernacle Church, and there, with ample space for deployment, to form for battle, and move against the rear of Mary's Hill. But before his advanced guards got clear of the forest defiles, they found the Confederates across their path, displaying an unmistakable purpose of pressing the attack. Hooker at once concluded that Lee was marching against him with nearly his whole force, and of the strength of that force, owing to the weakness of his cavalry, he was not aware. The news from the Stafford Heights was disquieting. As soon as the fog had lifted, about 9 o'clock in the morning, the signal officers and balloonists had descried long columns of troops and trains marching rapidly towards Chancellorsville. This was duly reported by the telegraph, and it was correctly inferred to signify that Lee was concentrating against the Federal right. But at the same time, various movements were observed about Hamilton's Crossing. Columns appeared marching from the direction of Gurney's Station. There was much traffic on the railway, and several deserters from Lee's army declared, on being examined, that Hood's and Pickett's divisions had arrived from Richmond. The statements of these men, who we may suspect were not such traitors as they appeared, were confirmed by the fact that Sedgwick, who was without cavalry, had noticed no diminution in the force which held the ridge before him. It is easy, then, to understand Hooker's decision to stand on the defensive. With a prudent foresight which does him much credit, before he marched in the morning he had ordered the position about Chancellorsville, covering his lines of retreat to United States and Ely's Fords, to be reconnoitred and entrenched, and his front, as Lee said, was undoubtedly very strong. He would assuredly have done better had he attacked vigorously when he found the Confederates advancing. His sudden retrograde movement, especially as following the swift and successful manoeuvres which had turned Lee's position, could not fail to have a discouraging effect upon the troops. And if Sedgwick had been ordered to storm the Fredericksburg lines, the whole Federal force could have been employed, and the Confederates, assailed in front and rear simultaneously, must, to say the least, have been embarrassed. But in abandoning his design of crushing Lee between his 2 wings, and in retiring to the stronghold he had prepared, Hooker did what most ordinary generals would have done, especially one who had served on the losing side at Fredericksburg. He had there learned the value of entrenchments. He had seen division after division shatter itself in vain against a stone wall and a few gun pits, and it is little wonder that he had imbibed a profound respect for defensive tactics. He omitted, however, to take into consideration 2 simple facts. First, that few districts contain 2 such positions as those of the Confederates at Fredericksburg, and secondly, that the strength of a position is measured not by the impregnability of the front, but by the security of the flanks. The Fredericksburg lines, resting on the Rappahannock and the Massaponax, had apparently safe flanks, and yet he himself had completely turned them, rendering the whole series of works useless without firing a shot. Were Lee and Jackson the men to knock their heads, like Burnside, against stout breastworks strongly manned? Would they not rather make a wide sweep exactly as he himself had done, and force him to come out of his works? Hooker, however, may have said that if they marched across his front, he would attack them en route, as did Napoleon at Austerlitz and Wellington at Salamanca, and cut their army in two. But here he came face to face with the fatal defect of the lines he had selected, and also of the disposition he had made of his cavalry. The country near Chancellorsville was very unlike the rolling plains of Austerlitz or the bare downs of Salamanca. From no part of the federal position did the view extend for more than a few hundred yards. Wherever the eye turned rose the dark and impenetrable screen of close-growing trees, interlaced with wild vines and matted undergrowth, and seamed with rough roads, perfectly passable for troops, with which his enemies were far better acquainted than himself. Had Stoneman's cavalry been present, the squadrons, posted far out upon the flanks and watching every track, might have given ample warning of any turning movement, exactly as Stuart's cavalry had given Lee warning of Hooker's own movement upon Chancellorsville. As it was, Pleasonton's brigade was too weak to make head against Stuart's regiments, and Hooker could expect no early information of his enemy's movements. He thus found himself in the dilemma which a general on the defensive, if he be weak in cavalry, has almost invariably to face, especially in a close country. He was ignorant, and must necessarily remain ignorant, of where the main attack would be made. Lee, on the other hand, by means of his superior cavalry, could reconnoitre the position at his leisure, and if he discovered a weak point could suddenly throw the greater portion of his force against it. Hooker could only hope that no weak point existed. Remembering that the Confederates were on the pike and the plank road, there certainly appeared no cause for apprehension. The Fifth Corps, with its flank on the Rappahannock, held the left, covering the river and the old mine roads. Next in succession came the Second Corps, blocking the pike. In the centre, the 12th Corps, under General Slocum, covered Chancellorsville. The Third Corps, under Sickles, held Hazel Grove, with Berry's division as general reserve, and on the extreme right, his breastworks running along the plank road as far as Talley's Clearing, was Howard with the 11th Corps, composed principally of German regiments. Strong outposts of infantry had been thrown out into the woods. The men were still working in the entrenchments. Batteries were disposed so as to sweep every approach from the south, the southeast, or the southwest, and there were at least 5 men to every yard of parapet. The line, however, 6 miles from flank to flank, was somewhat extensive, and to make certain, so far as possible, that sufficient numbers should be forthcoming to defend the position, at 1:55 on the morning of May 2nd, Sedgwick was instructed to send the 1st Army Corps to Chancellorsville. Before midnight, moreover, 34 guns, principally horse artillery, together with a brigade of infantry, were sent from Falmouth to Banks Ford. Sedgwick, meantime, below Fredericksburg, had contented himself with engaging the outposts on the opposite ridge. An order to make a brisk demonstration, which Hooker had dispatched at 11:30 a.m., did not arrive, the telegraph having broken down, until 5:45 p.m., 6 hours later, and it was then too late to effect any diversion in favour of the main army. Yet it can hardly be said that Sedgwick had risen to the height of his responsibilities. He knew that a portion at least of the Confederates had marched against Hooker, and the balloonists had early reported that a battle was in progress near Tabernacle Church. But instead of obeying Napoleon's maxim and marching to the sound of the cannon, he had made no effort to send support to his commander. Both he and General Reynolds considered that to have attacked before Hooker had accomplished some success, in view of the strong position and numbers in their front, might have failed to dislodge the enemy and have rendered them unserviceable at the proper time. That is, they were not inclined to risk their own commands in order to assist Hooker, of whose movements they were uncertain. Yet even if they had been defeated, Hooker would still have had more men than Lee. Chapter 24. Chancellorsville. Continued. At a council of war held during the night at Chancellorsville House, the Federal generals were by no means unanimous as to the operations of the morrow. Some of the generals advised an early assault. Others favoured a strictly defensive attitude. Hooker himself wished to contract his lines so as to strengthen them, but as the officers commanding on the right were confident of the strength of their entrenchments, it was at length determined that the army should await attack in its present position. 3 miles down the plank road, under a grove of oak and pine, Lee and Jackson, while their wearied soldiers slept around them, planned for the fourth and the last time the overthrow of the great army with which Lincoln still hoped to capture Richmond. At this council there was no difference of opinion. If Hooker had not retreated before the morning, and Jackson thought it possible he was already demoralized, he was to be attacked. The situation admitted of no other course. It was undoubtedly a hazardous operation for an inferior force to assault an entrenched position, but the Federal army was divided, the right wing involved in a difficult and unexplored country, with which the Confederate generals and staff were more or less familiar, and an opportunity so favourable might never recur. "Fortune," says Napoleon, "is a woman who must be wooed while she is in the mood. If her favours are rejected, she does not offer them again." The only question was where the attack should be delivered. Lee himself had reconnoitred the enemy's left. It was very strong, resting on the Rappahannock, and covered by a stream called Mineral Spring Run. 2 of Jackson's staff officers had reconnoitred the front and had pronounced it impregnable, except at a fearful sacrifice of life. But while the generals were debating, Stuart rode in with the reports of his cavalry officers, and the weak point of the position was at once revealed. General Fitzhugh Lee, to whose skill and activity the victory of Chancellorsville was in great part due, had discovered that the Federal right on the plank road was completely in the air. That is, it was protected by no natural obstacle, and the breastworks faced south and south only. It was evident that attack from the west or northwest was not anticipated, and Lee at once seized upon the chance of effecting a surprise. Yet the difficulties of the proposed operation were very great. To transfer a turning column to a point from which the Federal right might be effectively outflanked necessitated a long march by the narrow and intricate roadways of the wilderness, and a division of the Confederate army into 2 parts, between which communication would be most precarious. To take advantage of the opportunity, the first rule of war must be violated. But as it has already been said, the rules of war only point out the dangers which are incurred by breaking them, and, in this case, before an enemy on the defensive from whom the separation might be concealed until it is too late for him to intervene, the risks of dispersion were much reduced. The chief danger lay in this, that the 2 wings, each left to its own resources, might fail to act in combination, just as within the past 24 hours Hooker and Sedgwick had failed. But Lee knew that in Jackson he possessed a lieutenant whose resolution was invincible, and that the turning column, if entrusted to his charge, would be pushed forward without stop or stay, until it had either joined hands with the main body, or had been annihilated. Moreover, the Battle of Fredericksburg had taught both armies that the elaborate constructions of the engineer are not the only or the most useful resources of fortification. Hooker had ordered his position to be entrenched in the hope that Lee and Jackson, following Burnside's example, would dash their divisions into fragments against them, and thus become an easy prey. Lee, with a broader appreciation of the true tactical bearing of ditch and parapet, determined to employ them as a shelter for his own force until Jackson's movement was completed and the time had come for a general advance. Orders were at once sent to General McLaws to cover his front, extending across the pike and the plank roads with a line of breastworks. And long before daylight the soldiers of his division, with the scanty means at their disposal, were busy as beavers amongst the timber. It only remained, then, to determine the route and the strength of the outflanking force, and here it may be observed that the headquarters staff appears to have neglected certain precautions for which there had been ample leisure. So long ago as March 19th, a council of war had decided that if Hooker attacked, he would do so by the upper fords, and yet the wilderness, lying immediately south of the points of passage, had not been adequately examined. Had Jackson been on the left wing above Fredericksburg, instead of on the right, near Hamilton's Crossing, we may be certain that accurate surveys would have been forthcoming. As it was, the charts furnished to the Commander-in-Chief were untrustworthy, and information had to be sought from the country people. May 2nd, 2:30 a.m. About daylight on May 2nd, says Major Hotchkiss, General Jackson awakened me and requested that I would at once go down to Catherine Furnace, which is quite near, and where a Colonel Welford lived, and ascertain if there was any road by which we could secretly pass round Chancellorsville to the vicinity of Old Wilderness Tavern. I had a map which our engineers had prepared from actual surveys of the surrounding country, showing all the public roads, but with few details of the intermediate topography. Reaching Mr. Welford's, I aroused him from his bed, and soon learned that he himself had recently opened a road through the woods in that direction for the purpose of hauling cord, wood, and iron ore to his furnace. This I located on the map, and having asked Mr. Welford if he would act as a guide if it became necessary to march over that road, I returned to headquarters. 3:30 a.m. When I reached those, I found Generals Lee and Jackson in conference, each seated on a cracker box, from a pile which had been left there by the Federals the day before. In response to General Jackson's request for my report, I put another cracker box between the two generals, on which I spread the map, showed them the road I had ascertained, and indicated, so far as I knew it, the position of the Federal Army. General Lee then said, "General Jackson, what do you propose to do?" He replied, "Go around here," moving his finger over the road which I had located upon the map. General Lee said, "What do you propose to make this movement with?" "With my whole corps," was the answer. General Lee then asked, "What will you leave me?" "The divisions of Anderson and McLaws," said Jackson. General Lee, after a moment's reflection, remarked, "Well, go on," and then, pencil in hand, gave his last instructions. Jackson, with an eager smile upon his face, from time to time nodded assent, and when the Commander-in-Chief ended with the words, "General Stuart will cover your movement with his cavalry," he rose and saluted, saying, "My troops will move at once, sir." 4:05 a.m. The necessary orders were forthwith dispatched. The trains, parked in open fields to the rear, were to move to Todd's Tavern, and thence westward by interior roads. The Second Army Corps was to march in one column, Rhodes's division in front and A.P. Hill's in rear. The 1st Virginia Cavalry, with whom was Fitzhugh Lee, covered the front. Squadrons of the 2nd, the 3rd, and the 5th were on the right. Hotchkiss, accompanied by a squad of couriers, was to send back constant reports to General Lee. The commanding officers were impressed with the importance of celerity and secrecy. The ranks were to be kept well closed up, and all stragglers were to be bayoneted. 4:05 a.m. The day had broken without a cloud, and as the troops began their march in the fresh May morning, the green vistas of the wilderness, grass underfoot, and thick foliage overhead were dappled with sunshine. The men, comprehending intuitively that a daring and decisive movement was in progress, pressed rapidly forward, and General Lee, standing by the roadside to watch them pass, saw in their confident bearing the presage of success. Soon after the first regiments had gone by, Jackson himself appeared at the head of his staff. Opposite to the Commander-in-Chief, he drew rein, and the two conversed for a few moments. Then Jackson rode on, pointing in the direction in which his troops were moving. His face, says an eyewitness, was a little flushed as it was turned to General Lee, who nodded approval of what he said. Such was the last interview between Lee and Jackson. Then, during 4 long hours, for the column covered at least 10 miles, the flood of bright rifles and tattered uniforms swept with steady flow down the forest track. The artillery followed, the guns drawn by lean and wiry horses, and the ammunition wagons and ambulances brought up the rear. In front was a regiment of cavalry, the 5th Virginia, accompanied by General Fitzhugh Lee. On the flanks were some 10 squadrons, moving by the tracks nearest the enemy's outposts. A regiment of infantry, the 23rd Georgia, was posted at the crossroads near Catherine Furnace, and the plank road was well guarded until Anderson's troops came up to relieve the rear brigades of the Second Army Corps. Meanwhile, acting under the immediate orders of General Lee, and most skillfully handled by McLaws and Anderson, the 10,000 Confederates who had been left in position opposite the Federal masses kept up a brisk demonstration. Artillery was brought up to every point along the front, which offered space for action. Skirmishers, covered by the timber, engaged the enemy's pickets and maintained a constant fire, and both on the pike and the river road the lines of battle, disposed so as to give an impression of great strength, threatened instant assault. Despite all precautions, however, Jackson's movement did not escape the notice of the Federals. 8 a.m. A mile north of Catherine Furnace, the eminence called Hazel Grove, clear of timber, looked down the valley of the Lewis Creek, and as early as 8 a.m., General Birney, commanding the Federal division at this point, reported the passage of a long column across his front. The indications, however, were deceptive. At first, it is probable, the movement seemed merely a prolongation of the Confederate front, but it soon received a different interpretation. The road at the point where Jackson's column was observed turned due south. It was noticed that the troops were followed by their wagons, and that they were turning their backs on the Federal lines. Hooker, when he received Birney's report, jumped to the conclusion that Lee, finding the direct road to Richmond through Bowling Green, threatened by Sedgwick, was retreating on Gordonsville. 11 a.m. About 11 a.m., a battery was ordered into action on the Hazel Grove Heights. 12 to 15 p.m. The fire caused some confusion in the Confederate ranks. The trains were forced onto another road, and shortly after noon, General Sickles, commanding the Third Army Corps, was permitted by Hooker to advance upon Catherine Furnace and to develop the situation. Birney's division moved forward, and Whipple's soon followed. This attack, which threatened to cut the Confederate army in two, was so vigorously opposed by Anderson's division astride the Plank Road and by the 23rd Georgia at the Furnace that General Sickles was constrained to call for reinforcements. Barlow's brigade, which had hitherto formed the reserve of the 11th Corps, holding the extreme right of the Federal line, the flank at which Jackson was aiming, was sent to his assistance. Pleasonton's cavalry brigade followed. Sickles' movement, even before the fresh troops arrived, had met with some success. The 23rd Georgia, driven back to the unfinished railroad and surrounded, lost 300 officers and men. But word had been sent to Jackson's column, and Colonel Brown's artillery battalion, together with the brigades of Archer and Thomas, rapidly retracing their steps, checked the advance in front, while Anderson, manoeuvring his troops with vigour, struck heavily against the flank. Jackson's train, thus effectively protected, passed the dangerous point in safety, and then Archer and Thomas, leaving Anderson to deal with Sickles, drew off and pursued their march. These operations, conducted for the most part in blind thickets, consumed much time, and Jackson was already far in advance. Moving in a southwesterly direction, he had struck the Brook Road, a narrow track which runs nearly due north and crosses both the Plank Road and the Pike at a point about 2 miles west of the Federal right flank. The Brock Road, which, had Stoneman's 3 divisions of cavalry been present with the Federal army, would have been strongly held, was absolutely free and unobstructed. Since the previous evening, Fitzhugh Lee's patrols had remained in close touch with the enemy's outposts, and no attempt had been made to drive them in. So with no further obstacle than the heat, the Second Army Corps pressed on. Away to the right, echoing faintly through the wilderness, came the sound of cannon and the roll of musketry. Couriers from the rear, galloping at top speed, reported that the trains had been attacked, that the rear brigades had turned back to save them, and that the enemy, in heavy strength, had already filled the gap which divided the Confederate wings. But though the army was cut in two, Jackson cast no look behind him. The battle at the Furnace made no more impression on him than if it was being waged on the Mississippi. He had his orders to execute, and above all, he was moving at his best speed towards the enemy's weak point. He knew, and none better, that Hooker would not long retain the initiative. that every man detached from the Federal centre made his own chances of success the more certain, and trusting implicitly in Lee's ability to stave off defeat, he rode northwards with redoubled assurance of decisive victory. Forward was the cry, and though the heat was stifling and the dust, rising from the deep ruts on the unmetalled road, rose in dense clouds beneath the trees, and men dropped fainting in the ranks, the great column pushed on without a check. 2 p.m. About 2 p.m., as the rear brigades, Archer and Thomas, after checking sickles, were just leaving Welford's house, some 6 miles distant, Jackson himself had reached the plank road, the point where he intended to turn eastward against the Federal flank. Here he was met by Fitzhugh Lee, conveying most important and surprising information. The cavalry regiment had halted when it arrived on the plank road. All was reported quiet at the front. The patrols were moving northward, and, attended by a staff officer, the young brigadier had ridden towards the turnpike. The path they followed led to a wide clearing at the summit of a hill, from which there was a view eastward as far as Dowdall's Tavern. Below, and but a few hundred yards distant, ran the Federal breastworks, with a battis in front and long lines of stacked arms in rear, but untenanted by a single company. 2 cannon were seen upon the high road, the horses grazing quietly near at hand. The soldiers were scattered in small groups, laughing, cooking, smoking, sleeping and playing cards, while others were butchering cattle and drawing rations. What followed is best told in General Fitzhugh Lee's own words. I rode back and met Jackson. "General," said I, "if you will ride with me, halting your columns here out of sight, I will show you the great advantage of attacking down the old turnpike instead of the plank road, the enemy's lines being taken in reverse. Bring only 1 courier, as you will be in view from the top of the hill." Jackson assented. When we reached the eminence, the picture below was still unchanged, and I watched him closely as he gazed on Howard's troops. His expression was one of intense interest. His eyes burnt with a brilliant glow, and his face was slightly flushed, radiant at the success of his flank movement. To the remarks made to him while the unconscious line of blue was pointed out, he made no reply, and yet during the 5 minutes he was on the hill his lips were moving. "Tell General Rhodes," he said, suddenly turning his horse towards the courier, "to move across the plank road and halt when he gets to the old turnpike. I will join him there." One more look at the Federal lines, and he rode rapidly down the hill. 4 p.m. The cavalry, supported by the Stonewall Brigade, was immediately placed a short distance down the plank road, in order to mask the march of the column. At 4 p.m, Rhodes was on the turnpike. Passing down it for about a mile in the direction of the enemy's position, the troops were ordered to halt and form for battle. Not a shot had been fired. A few hostile patrols had been observed, but along the line of breastworks, watched closely by the cavalry, the Federal troops, still in the most careless security, were preparing their evening meal. Jackson, meanwhile, seated on a stump near the Brock Road, had penned his last dispatch to General Lee. Near 3 p.m, May 2nd, 1863. General, the enemy has made a stand at Chancellor's, which is about 2 miles from Chancellorsville. I hope as soon as practicable to attack. I trust that an ever-kind Providence will bless us with great success. Respectfully, T.J. Jackson, Lieutenant General. The leading division is up, and the next 2 appear to be well closed. T.J. J.J. General B.E. Lee. 25,000 men were now deploying in the forest within a mile of the Federal works, overlapping them both to north and south, and not a single general in the Northern Army appears to have suspected their presence. The day had passed quietly at Chancellorsville. At a very early hour in the morning, Hooker, anticipating a vigorous attack, had ordered the First Army Corps, which had hitherto been acting with Sedgwick below Fredericksburg, to recross the Rappahannock and march to Chancellorsville. Averill's division of cavalry also, which had been engaged near Orange Courthouse with W.H.F. Lee's 2 regiments, was instructed about the same time to rejoin the army as soon as possible, and was now marching by the left bank of the Rapidan to Ely's Ford. Anticipating, therefore, that he would soon be strongly reinforced, Hooker betrayed no uneasiness. Shortly after dawn he had ridden round his lines. Expecting at that time to be attacked in front only, he had no fault to find with their location or construction. As he looked over the barricades, says General Howard, while receiving the cheers and salutes of the men, he said to me, "How strong! How strong!" When the news came that a Confederate column was marching westward past Catherine Furnace, his attention for the moment was attracted to his right. At 10 a.m. he was still uncertain as to the meaning of Jackson's movement. As the hours went by, however, and Jackson's column disappeared in the forest, he again grew confident. The generals were informed that Lee was in full retreat towards Gordonsville, and a little later Sedgwick received the following. Chancellorsville, May 2, 1863, 4:10 p.m.